thanks for joining in for another Broken Meeple Top 10, and this is going to be a somewhat subjective list, I have to admit. These are my top 10 games that I consider to have low complexity, but with a good degree of depth. So low complexity, high depth, whatever you want to call it. Now, as much as this is a top 10, you're going to have to take that with a pinch of salt, because when I was doing this list, there was a lot of choices. Like, I mean, a lot. And I'm pretty positive you could probably times my list by 100 and still come up with suitable games for a list. And then trying to rank one is like, how do I say that this one's better than that one, given that maybe this one's a little bit more complex, but then this one has a bit more depth? It just became a bit of a nightmare, but this was a heavily requested list. So essentially I have given 10 games here, and I have ranked them in my personal opinion, but for what it's worth, you don't have to pay too much attention to the ranking. You could almost consider this list as 10 games with low complexity and high depth. And what do I mean by that? Well, you know, if a game has got like a bucket load of rules and a ton of pages, and it's like 10 pages to learn how to move and stuff like that, then you expect it to be quite a brain burner, to have a lot of depth, you know, a lot of thought and planning and and decisions that you have to make. But when something only has, say, like a couple of pages of rules and it's fairly simplistic, you expect it to be like practically autopilot. But there are some games that manage to give you a surprising amount of depth despite only having like maybe a few rules that you have to teach. And these were basically, I must have, God knows how many I had on this list. It was somewhat ridiculous, but I've effectively picked 10 from here, not necessarily my 10 favourite, but 10 that I think kind of do that nice balance between the two. And like I say, I'm just going to talk about 10. So try not to pay too much attention to the rankings, even though I have tried to rank these in my personal opinion. But to be honest, every single game that I had on my short list, and I'll mention a bunch of them later, could have easily qualified, I think. And I'm sure you've got plenty of ideas. So by all means, list them in the comments. Let's get started. My number 10 is not a cheat. Yes, this might be my favourite game ever, or at least it was in my last top 100. Ooh, who knows? But it's certainly a game which I consider to have a fair amount of depth for a co-op game, despite, at the end of the day, being pretty simplistic. Granted, if you feed it with expansion after expansion after expansion, it does get a bit more complex. But if you just took the base game, maybe one expansion on top, Sentinels of the Multiverse actually is fairly in-depth for what it is. Because look at the back of the book. You know, what do you have to actually learn in this game? The cards are fairly basic abilities. Like I say, don't consider all the expansions on top of it. You know, think about like the base set and maybe one expansion tops. And, you know, the abilities are pretty straightforward. You have two types of cards, and your turn sequence is literally to play a card, use a power, draw a card. That's it. One person can handle the admin of dealing with the boss and the environment and that, and relay it to the other players. But I've took this game fairly well against people who have barely seen games, who are not used to complexity, and some of that goes down towards the theme. The theme is very strong in this game, and with the simple turn sequence and one guy handling the admin, which is usually me, this works pretty well. Now, granted, I admit, when you get a lot of cards out and when you feed in expansions, the complexity does go up. You've got a lot of things happening at once. Again, have somebody helping you. But this is why it's my number 10. I didn't want to put it any higher than this for that reason. But I don't think it's that complex a game. And you do have a lot of decisions to make. People think, oh, it's autopilot, you just play a card, any card. No, no, no. You've got several cards at your disposal, and you've only got like one power typically a turn, and you'll have a selection of powers. And depending on what villain you face and what environment you're in, they can throw up other things. Like, you know, what have you got to consider? Do I go after the villain and start whittling him down, or do I better take out his minions first? Oh, but that buff he's got is going to be really annoying. So I take the buff out first and then worry about him. Who's after us? You know, you're after us. Can you heal me up? Because I'm going to get whacked by this next turn, which means that's going to hurt, you know, probably kill me off. I need healing right now. Or can you take some of the damage? There's a lot of considerations when you think about it for a co-op, for a fairly simple co-op. Like I say, not too many expansions, just stick to base set and maybe one expansion tops just for a bit of added variety. And it's a relatively simple game that keeps you thinking, like a good superhero game should. Right, well in case my number 10 wasn't exactly to your liking, hopefully my number 9 onwards will be better, but I don't know, we'll see. This little card game, it's got barely any rules in it at all. You have a very simple turn sequence, you have 4 actions that you will do in each round. The game goes on from between 1 to 3 rounds, but every decision you make, you are there having to consider what your opponent might know, what you know, the board state, what's it like after round 1 when you have favour over certain cards and your opponent has over certain cards. It's constantly making you frustrated at every decision you make for what is a titchy little 2-player card game, and that is Hanamakoji. And no, this is not a foul, because as much as I like this game, somebody on my Patreon campaign actually suggested this as a Patreon choice. So it's not just me that considers this. But with Hanamakoji, you are effectively trying to win favour over a row of geisha and the geisha cards. Each of them has a set number of items, and you have a hand of cards, and the way you win favour is by majority holdings. But you have 4 different actions that you do. 2 of them are based on the classic I pick you choose mechanic, yeah, get it right, where you lay out some cards, your opponent gets to pick first, and then you get the rest. And a couple are based on letting some stay in a round and let some be scrapped out of the round. And you can do these actions in any order you like. Doesn't have to be what the opponent does, but whichever actions you leave till last, you have less choice over. The ones you do first, though, you have more. But you have to base your decisions on what you think your opponent's going to do. There's an element of push your luck. There's an element of bluffing. There's definitely an element of, like, you know, trying to get in your opponent's head and think, what is he trying to do? Why has he laid out the cards like that? He's given me a 3, and a 5. Is he trying to goad me into that 5? What card is he hidden under there? You've got to think about these things. And if you think this is just an autopilot game, then play this game against me. I will beat you senseless. Because I'm not saying I'm an expert at this game, but like I say, you can't. I've won more games of this than I've lost. You can't autopilot this. You know, you have to be thinking about it. And people will play this game for the first time, and even though the rules are simple, they'll be like, oh my god, I got no idea what to do. And then after the first game, they go, right, I'm picking this up. Right, let's go again. I'm going to get you. And when you get that kind of reaction for a game with barely any rules, I mean, this is just a small little card game, that proves it's got to have a fair amount of depth. Yes, we're not talking strategic depth here, but we're certainly talking enough that makes your brain really start thinking and really like agonizing over every decision you make, no matter what order you do those actions in, despite the fact that I can teach you this game in less than 2 minutes. Very simple, but very effective. Hanamakoji. Number 8 gets the pick out of this particular genre because the rules are not complex at all, but you still have to consider, positioning and, like, what's the word, spatial awareness. And it's one of those polyomino style games, where you lay out the Tetris pieces on a board and you've got to try and lay them out in as efficient a way as possible. And you'll think, no, maybe I'm talking about like the cottage garden and the patchwork and all that lot. No. Cottage Garden is a little bit too fiddly in places. There's a fair amount of rules to it, and for what you get in those rules, it's still not that complex of a game. You feel like you could learn it in less rules and still play the same sort of game. Well, you can, because my favourite in this genre, Baron Park, does the job the same way, but with much less rules. The rulebook in this is dirt simple, even when you play with the advanced variant to add the objectives, which you should do all the time. But with Baron Park, you're just creating a bear park. The theme is pasted, but, I like bears, as I say often enough in my Board Game Approved segment on Board Game Breakfast. But it's the idea that you have to plan ahead for what the tiles you want to place are. And you may think, oh, well, come on, anybody can play Tetris. You want to bet on that? There are lots of people I play this game with where they struggle to think ahead as to where they should be putting pieces. And I'll notice that by the end of the game, they're like, oh, I've got to get a couple of toilet squares for those little bits that I blocked off. And, you need to be efficient. You need to be, like, good at getting those bear statues, but then you might also have to get the normal bear parks. And then you need those 3 orange ones, and have you left enough room so that you can place those orange tiles? Or did you wait too long? Are your symbols too spread out? How are you going to build your park? You're going to do it in a 2x2 square. You're going to do one big line that way or that way. You're going to do an S-bend I've done before, a T shape. Where are the symbols in relation to your next tile? What are the objectives? Do I need to do 3 in a row? In which case, like 3 food stands in a row. Well, I need to plan ahead for that. So I'll get this tile. I need to make sure that covers that. All this thought going through your head. And all I have to teach you in this game is put a tile down, cover symbols, get more tiles, claim those objectives, end of the game, score up as many points as you see on your board, no multiplication tables or nothing. It's dirt simple of a game, great, light fun. I've lost count of how many times I have played this, how many times I have taught this game. This is one of my go-to top 10 gateway games. It just constantly gets played, even without my help. People just see it on the shelf at the dice, like teaching stuff that I do. And even though the game's called Baron Park, which for most people are going to be like, huh? What on earth's this? They grab it off the shelf, they get it open, even without my help. They usually get into the game, but as soon as I see anyone pulling this off a shelf, it's like, 5 minutes, I'll get your teal, and they love it. It's surprisingly in-depth for the simplistic rules that you've got. Cottage Garden and that is okay, but you've got to do the fiddly cube tracks. Then you've got that, which isn't thematic whatsoever. You've got the moving around the square bitten, where you're choosing the tiles from this grid in the middle, and you've got restrictions on when you can do that. And then you've got the cats, and then you've got the pots. There's a bit extra going on in something like Cottage Garden, and I've not played Indian Summer or Spring Meadow or something like that. I've not played those two, so I don't know if they would fit the bill, but Cottage Garden kind of burnt me a bit. So this is my pick, and I think for what little rules there are, it's got some depth to it. Number 7, we're going on to a game now that I would consider is a little bit more involved than most of the games on this list, but I feel that there's not a huge amount of rules to it, but you do have a lot to consider with the little mini auctions that take place, when you're bidding for certain tiles. And if you're one of the people who has played Carcassonne, then you already kind of got the gist of how this game ticks. And as much as I give this designer a bit of hate, I'll admit, for a lot of his games, because, like I say, it's just not my style. The games he does, like Great Western Trail and Blackout and things like that, are just not to my liking. This is the one game I have of his in my collection, and it is the one game that I basically sing the praises about, because I feel he should have just stuck with this kind of game. Isle of Skye. Not a difficult game. Think about base set only. Do not get that stupid Journeyman expansion. God, that was horrendous. I mean, hello. Oh, look at this nice little simple game. Let me overcomplicate it like crazy. It's like, no, horrible. But the Druids expansion is actually pretty sweet. I'm not planning to do a review on that. Maybe I'll do an anthology later, but solid. Anyway, back to the point. The base set alone, all you have to do is just play tiles on a little map. You're connecting the regions together. Roads don't matter. Okay, nice, straightforward. And then you've just got to explain a little bit about how the auction mechanic works, where you select a couple of tiles and you bid coins on the various other tiles, get them, and you're trying to meet the objective conditions in order to score points. That's pretty much the round. Not that complex, even though it's a bit more involved than the ones I've just mentioned. But you need to think about what objectives you're going for, those scrolls that give you bonus points. Are you going to be able to get them? Do you have the tiles to close off the region so that they're worth more? And most of the fault in this game comes from planning ahead for those times when you know certain objectives are going to be open. And it's like, do I try and score heavily on it now, or do I wait till later, take the hit, and then when I'm getting a bit more money from being at the back, because you get more money each round for being last as opposed to first, so it's actually better not to be ahead all the time. Other things to think about. But the auction part, where you got to think, how many coins am I going to price these two tiles at? Do I want these two tiles? I really want them, but I don't want people to buy them. But then I don't want to splash a ton of money on them either and lose it. I need some money to spend. Let's have a look around. The lake, that's pretty juicy. I could get that one. I'll bid so much for that. Oh, but I can only get so much. Lots of money management, lots of tile placement. You've got the spatial awareness thing again. You've got to think, right, I need green terrain for that. I need to build a big lake. I need another lake here. If you're trying to get income, you've got to get those barrels and then find the road to get to your castle. There's a lot to consider. A lot of depth goes into this. But when you think about the rulebook and think about what the base game offers, not a lot to it. A reference guide is there for all the different objectives, and you only use, I think, 4 of them in any game. So it's not like you've got to learn that many. And the auction thing is the bread and butter of it, really. And most people know how to build a map out of tiles, connect the terrain together. As long as they're cool with the fact that the roads don't have to connect, then whoopie-doo. And if they play Carcassonne, well, you're already halfway there. So it's not a particularly hard game, like complexity-wise. But boy, it makes you think. This is easily my pick of Alexander Pfister's like choice of games, and this was the first time I even heard of him. I thought like, oh, this is a cool game. It's light, not complex, but it makes me think. Sweet, top 100 game. And then suddenly we had Mombasa and then Blackout, and Great Western Trail and Blackout, and it was like, bleh. But oh well, just not my style. But I still hang on to this one. Solid, probably is it the heaviest game I've got on this list? One might be able to beat it in terms of being heavier, but we'll see. But certainly I think it just reaches that nice border of just under the level of too much complexity, but really does make you think. Isle of Skye. And number 6, I just did a solo play of, actually. This is a bag building solo-only game. And do you think bag building's got a lot of depth to it? Well, people rave on and on about Orleans and Altiplano, despite them being probably the worst of all the bag building games out there. But, I've got Automobiles and a couple of others for that. But this one, for a solo game, not very many rules. You just have to know what the three different color of tokens do, what the different coffee beans do, and, just basically how the turn sequence works, and what you're aiming to do. But the rules are pretty straightforward. But when you pull those chips out of the bag, you've got a lot to think about. You've got to really consider what to do with those tokens. Get it down here. Surprisingly, this is not an autopilot game. Yes, there's an element of luck with bag building, but then if you're going to argue that point with this, then, well, Orleans and Altiplano, hello. But those games have got a lot of rules, they're fairly complex, and they take about, well, at least 2 hours a piece, if not longer, I think. Nearly 3 hours with Altiplano at times. But the crux of this, if you watch my solo play of it, I was doing a very simple example. But you use some of the harder coffees in here, and you've got all sorts of different tokens in the bag. You'll draw some out. It's like, oh, great. I could do that ability with this. I could stop those beans from leveling, but I really could do with getting the sweetness for the coffee. How long am I actually going to brew this thing? I've got 2 rounds before I hit the smoke. Smoke's good, but then hang on, my beans are going to level really quickly. Do I want to level them up that quick? Shall I carry on until the next bit of smoke? Shall I go all the way to the end? Have I got too many tiles in my bag? How many have I got? Probably 10, 12? Well, the cup can only hold 10, so I don't want too many, but I've got room for error. Lots of things to consider, lots of things you can do with the tokens that you draw out of the bag, but it's just a simple solo game about making coffee. There's not that many rules for the various abilities. The pouring at the end is literally just draw 10 tiles, stick them in the cup and see what you end up with. Fairly straightforward, maybe could be a little simpler in places, but the rulebook explains it very well. I had no trouble learning this game. I can, I think, well, somebody pointed out one minor bit where I didn't level up a bean in my solo play, but, that's when I'm under pressure, that kind of happens. But for what it's worth, this is one of my surprise gem finds that I have found in my lifetime of playing games. One find Essen from a Korean company. I thought, why is everyone going mad about this coffee roaster? So glad I bought it because now it's so hard to get hold of. I hope they reprint it somehow and make it more accessible to people. But for what it's there, not that many rules. But every time I'm drawing tiles out of that bag, it's like, oh, what do I do now? And those kind of decisions, rinsed and repeated throughout the game with, even more decisions about when you're going to end it, when you're going to start pouring, or when you're going to use these tokens. Should you gamble on this? Plenty to think about. Definitely a lot of depth, because you will not be able to do the advanced and expert level coffees very well if you think that you can just simply autopilot it. You might be able to do that with some of the easier coffees, but yeah, you try doing an expert coffee soon and see how well you get on that scoreboard. My number 5, you might argue, isn't anywhere near as in-depth as a couple of the last ones that I've been doing, particularly like Isle of Skye and that. But the reason this goes midway up the list, in my opinion, is because it's so stupidly simple. As in, like, the rules. There's so little to teach in this game. But this is one of my go-to gateway games. It's a go-to gateway game for loads of people. In fact, it seems almost like cool to rag on it for some reason. Everybody keeps saying, oh, this game replaces it, or this game replaces it. First there was Century Spice Road, and then there was Majesty for the Realm. Which, to be fair, honourable mention, you could have sat Majesty of the Realm in this spot. But I didn't want 2 games from the same designer. Yeah, of course. How can I forget something like... Oops, nearly knocking stuff on the table. Splendor. This is the expansion, but, base set alone. Even with the expansion, it's not particularly complex, pretty easy to teach, but people who think this is autopilot, yeah, wrong. It's kind of, you've got to think about what you're doing in this. You cannot just simply buy whatever card just happens to come out that you can afford. You've got a limit of gems. There's a limit of what gems are available. You're thinking, well, let's see, I can buy that card, but hang on, could they buy it before me? Are they aiming for it? You look at the cards in the middle and you're thinking, well, I could chain, if I grab this, I could chain into that eventually, which eventually chains into that. Sweet. How many gems have I got? Can I hit my limit of 10? Oh, I need a few more of those. What's the word? Nomads? Not nomads. Nobles. That's it. What noble am I going for? Are there cards that allow me to do that? Is someone else gunning for it? Can I beat them to it? And even I have a habit in one tactic in the game is that if I have a chance to drain the gems in such a way that there's only 2 piles left and you can't take 2 from the same pile, I'll do it. I don't desperately need the gems, but I'll do it just to make sure that my opponents have now got a tough decision. Do I waste a turn only collecting 2 gems of different colours, or am I forced to spend my gems to buy something that I may not necessarily have needed? You've got to consider what everyone else is doing. This is not multiplayer solitaire. It's not terribly interactive, but you have to consider when someone might buy before you. Are they going to grab a noble? No, I'm saying nomad a lot. A noble before you. Can you chain into those bigger cards? And how are you going to do it? Are you going to buy a bunch of the cheap ones first and then think of a point when you start accelerating forward? Or are you going to just aim for big cards as quickly as possible and hope you'll hit 15 before someone gets their engine running? There's more to consider than meets the eye. And then you add the expansion, and it's modular, so you can just add one piece at a time, but it's not particularly complex even with the expansion. The Stronghold, I hate those. Trading Post and, what are they called? New Orient. Those modules, I use both of them at once, and it's still not that complex of a game. But use one of them at a time, the red cards or the Trading Post special powers, still a really easy game, but it adds even more depth and very little extra complexity. How can I forget something like Splendor for a list like this? It's not, the biggest brain burner in the world. But I frequently beat my parents at this. I frequently beat, new gamers if I'm teaching them this. And I'm not saying that to try and say, oh, I'm an expert at Splendor. Trust me, I'm sure there's a tournament player out there who can wipe the floor with me easily enough. But what I'm saying is that people will play this game, I'll see their reactions, and they are saying things like, oh, cool, I'm not quite certain what to do, or like, oh, you managed to nick that before me, I wasn't thinking about this, I need to think more about what you're doing, and if they're acknowledging the extra thought that's required, that's got to be proof enough. So Splendor, like I say, there are games with more depth than this, but for the simplicity, even with expansions, which you can't say about a lot of games, normally an expansion takes it out of that complexity zone, Splendor had to make this list. My number 4 is pretty straightforward to teach. You've got a lot of different cards, but effectively all you're doing is drawing a hand of cards from this one deck, but your cards have multiple uses. And multiple use cards instantly generates a good amount of depth for a game. But of course, you run the risk of it being too complex if you throw in too many uses for the cards or too many rules besides. But this is my go-to game for the first one to teach players this. Most people will be like, oh, I love Race for the Galaxy, it's so good, but it's got such a high learning curve that you cannot consider that gateway or low complexity, high depth or anything. And as such, I got put off Race for the Galaxy. What I prefer to do is teach people this, and that is San Juan. This is basically like a sort of a sister to both Race for the Galaxy and Puerto Rico in a sense, but you have a pretty simple onset. The buildings are easy to follow. The iconography is clear. That's money, and that's victory points. The effects are not difficult. Some produce a resource. The resource is just simply a card. You don't need to have different tokens everywhere. And you've got the different roles in the middle. But again, they're pretty simple. Build for a discount. Do some trading. Take nothing, but unless you took the tile, in which case 1 coin. It's pretty straightforward how it works, even though I'd probably maybe put this on the same level as Isle of Skye, I think. That kind of just under the cups of maybe too complex for this list. But This has definitely got a lot of depth to it, though, because you have to constantly be thinking about what you're going to do with these cards. Which building is it worth building? Yes, I've got to build 12 or whatever of them at the end, but do I really want to sacrifice? Because you want to build this building, but you need cards in order to afford those buildings, because your card is your income. So I need to give up free cards to build this free cost building, but I really wanted that building as well. So do I trade for more cards? Do I just suck it up and just go, you know what, this is the more important one? And then the rolls. When's the best time to take them? There's no good just taking a trade ability if you know that everybody else is going to trade for a ton of stuff as well. Wait for them to do it, and then you get a freebie. You want to build when you know no one else can build. So you have to, there's a lot of timing to take into effect. And with Puerto Rico, especially if you play with Puerto Rico Sharks, I like the game Puerto Rico, but my God, I hate playing it with people who know what they're doing, because it's just like, you sit in front of me, yes, you sit there, good, you did what? And it's irritating. With this one, you don't anywhere near have that kind of a problem. But rules, about Isle of Skye level, maybe. I still don't think it's too complex for this list. I have taught this many times, it's gone down well, but I think that having to deal with multiple use cards is definitely one that just screams out depth for a game. And it's not like, you might have some games that use like, oh, there's 2 uses for this card. Yeah, and the choices are dumb choice and right choice. No, here, it's hard to make your decisions, because every card, like 90% of the cards that you have in your hand, are typically useful for something. You just need to know what. And for that, San Juan deserves its number 4 spot. My number 3 goes back to that whole spatial awareness thing, like you need to forward plan where you're going to lay tiles, but rather than Tetris, this is simply just a case that they have to go on a grid, but as the game goes along, you have less choice as to where you can put the tiles. So you have to figure out, well, what's the best way for me to build early? What am I aiming for? Have I accidentally just painted myself into a corner so that I can't, get the tiles I want? But on top of that, you have to use these tokens, these arrows around this grid in order to pick the tiles you want. So you have to consider, does somebody else want that tile first? Are they going to block me? Do I have the numbered 1 to 4? Do I have the number architect that I need in order to grab this tile? Surprisingly, a lot of depth and a lot of forward planning required in a Days of Wonder game that has not got a lot of buzz lately, Quadropple. This kind of just came and went. It got a bit of a buzz when it first came out, but I never see anyone playing this. I don't hear people talking about it. I think I need to take it to the next teaching event. In fact, Portsmouth Comic Con's coming up later this year. I'll take it to that. It's got an expansion in it, so but they're only mini expansions. So base set alone, this is a wonderful game for low complexity and high depth, because you've got 2 versions. You've got the basic game and the expert game. The expert game, you wouldn't do it first. That maybe takes it a little bit above the complexity level, but not too much. But the base game still requires you to do that forward planning. The grid is simpler, and you have the 4 architects rather than a pool of architects. You have your own 4 specific. But you're having to lay them around this grid of tiles, and the number corresponds to how far along the grid you look before you pick that tile. So you're already restricted on where you can put your architects, but you get blocked off by other people. And your tiles, they generate they generate visitors or residents or whatever, and power. But if you have too much of them at the end of the game, they're worth negative points. So you've got to find some way to use them. Have you left yourself enough room to do that? Frequently, I play this game with people, and myself and other people will realize, why did I do that? You'll regret your earlier planning decisions as a result of this game. And being a Days of Wonder game, typically, other than things like 5 Tribes and that behind me, they tend to be low complexity. Not a lot of rules in this game. The reference guide for what the buildings do is pretty straightforward. You want to build towers of the residential blocks. You want to surround the park with resis. You want the harbours in a contiguous line. You want, stations next to shops. It's not that difficult to get what the buildings do, again, if you don't do the expert mode. But it looks pretty. It certainly makes you think. You can't autopilot this because you will lose outright, and that's like one of the biggest things. How much luck is in the game? Not a huge amount. The tiles come out in a random fashion, so everybody's affected by that. But at the end of the day, it's where you put the tiles and what architects you got left and what the other players do. You got to pay attention, and certainly keeps you thinking, keeps the brain cells firing. So Quadropple, I almost forgot about this one at first because it's been a while since I've gone out to the table. Like I say, it's kind of come and gone. But I still give this one props. It's a solid gateway game. I even might think it probably would make my top 10 gateway games if I said so. It's a solid city building game. Spatial awareness, the forward planning, all this stuff equals a good amount of depth. Doesn't take me long to teach you though. My number 2 might get a little hate. I don't know. I don't think this is a particularly complex game. Maybe I'm too used to it. I don't know. Leave your thoughts on that. But in terms of the rules, yes, you have to learn a few card abilities, but it's a tactical game. You don't learn all the card abilities to begin with. You learn them as you go through. And as far as I can tell, the only rules I really need to teach you in this game before we can get going is, okay, your turn sequence is either draw a card, play a card, use a dogma on a card, dominate, grab a point card, an objective card. That's pretty much your choices on your turn in terms of actions, and you do 2 actions. Not difficult. Okay, this is what a co-op dogma is, and this is what an aggressive dogma is. And we can start. Oh yeah, and this is splaying. We can start now. There's not a lot to teach, but my God, you have got to think a lot in this game. I almost consider this for my number 1. You cannot autopilot something like innovation. I love this card game. It does not get anywhere near enough play to my liking, mainly just because people have barely heard of it, and they look at the graphic design of it, and the graphic design's fine, but they look at the general artwork of the game, whatever artwork there is, and realise, abstract card game, not a fan. And I don't blame them. But, the tactical choices you make in this, because you can't be strategic. So the depth comes from the fact that you have to think on the fly. You've got to react to what you've drawn, what's out on the table, what symbols you've got, what symbols the opponent's got, what powers you have at your disposal, what powers they got. Is he about to use a power that's going to completely rip on you constantly, turn after turn after turn, where you better get some symbols to defend it or find a way to negate it? Are you going to get enough points to get the next domination for that age? And, are you gunning for getting to the last couple of ages and maybe doing one of those auto-win conditions? There's a lot you can think about in this game. And the way that the co-op and aggressive dogmas work, so, are you forcing your opponent to do something, or are you both gaining the same benefit? Do you want your opponent to gain the benefit, though, or are you just wanting to get it yourself? There's plenty to think about here, and that's before you throw in any of the expansions, although when you throw in a lot of the expansions, you're taking it out of that complexity zone. Like I say, this is the one reason I feel people might rag on this one, because they think it might be a bit too complex with those cards, but personally, I don't find the cards that complex to deal with. You've got a little bit of terminology to lose, so I'll grant you if you want to say that this is the most complex game on this list. Fine, no problem with that. But I don't feel that you have a lot of stuff to teach in terms of rules. Turn sequence is done within like a few seconds. It's so simple. All you've got to do is just explain certain bits of terminology. You have a reference card that shows you that anyway, and as people play this, I guarantee you they're thinking hard, they're freezing up as to, I got all these choices, but which one should I do? Which one is going to do better? And then we play the second game because they've enjoyed the first and go, I want to get into that more. I want to see more cards. And we carry on, and similar reaction. It's like all these different ways that the game can progress based on what cards you see and what your opponent does. This is a phenomenal 2-player game. Not so much with 3 or 4 by miles, but 2-player games are hard for me to get to the table, and this one in particular, being an abstract card game, is hard for me to sell. Unfortunately, Tom Vassal lives all the way over in Florida, which means I can't simply call on him to go play this game, because otherwise I'm sure the two of us would be playing this game relentlessly. Love it, love it, love it. Just hard to get to the table, but certainly for maybe, borderline amount of complexity, this has got a lot of depth. Because you can come up with a plan as a strategy and just follow that plan from start to finish, not needing to change what you think. The fact that this forces you to rethink your turn every turn proves it's got a lot of depth for what it has. And finally, my number 1, yes, I know that my number 2 is far more in-depth than this one is, and definitely more complex. But when I think about this game, and people suggest, have you got a game that's not that simple, not too simple to play, but, looks pretty, and, for what few rules there are will still make me think, there's one that always seems to come to mind. And when I thought more about it, I thought, there really isn't a lot of rules in this game. Here's your board, here's your bunch of stuff on it, You generate light every turn, you spend it to get these off your board, and place them on the board, get them off your player board and put them on the map, and then you grow them. Okay, not that difficult of a game. But then you've got to think about the sun going round the middle, and then you've got to think about the players getting in your way and growing trees above you. Yeah, if you've not guessed it by now, seriously, where have you been? Photosynthesis. I have to think, not a lot of rules in this game. And that's the basic version. Even the advanced version is not particularly difficult rules-wise. It's just a couple of tweaks, which is actually pretty interesting tweaks, actually. You should try it. But for what it is, you gotta think in this game. No autopiloting allowed. Because not only have you got the problem of everybody else getting in your face, I mean, this is a very interactive game, but you've got to try and grow above theirs, and more to the point, it's that sun that goes around the board and generates the light resource that you need to spend on your various trees and seeds. That is a lot of depth in the game, because you have got to forward plan a long way ahead to think, right, let's see, I'm going to get a ton here, a ton of light there, but at this rate, I'm not going to get anything for that one. Then I'll be okay, and then I'm going to suck again. So should I bank some for later, or should I spend it all now and just have a bad turn? Is there any way I can improve that turn? When do I get my big trees harvested? When's the right time? I've got one in the middle. Do I wait until near the end of the game before I harvest it, or do I get it nice and quick because it's being shadowed by other people? You know, there's a lot of stuff to consider, and you know, a lot of it comes down to forward planning. But how many rules do I really need to teach? It's all written on your board. You spend light to buy all this stuff. Here's the cost of everything. There's the cost of upgrading the tree. Here's the cost of harvesting a tree. Job done. Count up the points. End of. Play for 18 rounds, 3 years of 6 rounds each. But yeah, it does the trick. You know, granted, yes, there are games on this list that are more complex, but when you think about how much you have to think about what that sun is going to do, what you're going to do later, I mean, people freeze up in this game easily, and it's all very simple. And the concept is simple. It's just, why am I having to think about all these decisions and choices? Just because of a sun that goes around the board. It sounds simple enough, but believe me, makes you think. And it's gateway level. I could teach this to brand new gamers. I mean, they'd probably be a bit overwhelmed as to the choices, I don't know. But in terms of understanding the game, they could easily play this. And then after their first game, it's like, right, want to try it again, got to try it again. And, 2 players, it's already got a fair bit of depth, but you throw in 3 or 4 players, and it's like, whoo, you better start thinking, heavily, because you're going to get shadowed by trees all over the place. It just always seems to come to mind when I think of a simple game that's going to test the brain cells a bit and not be autopilot. So the fact that it always comes to mind, because a lot of the other games on this list, like Splendor, Splendor always comes to mind, and probably Barren Park as well. Those two always come to mind, but those ones are much simpler depth-wise, I think, than Photosynthesis. Certainly, I think Splendor's not got as much depth as this one can have, and Barren Park, maybe on par, but, maybe not quite as high as that one, but because, like I say, it's harder than it looks to judge that sun and plan ahead and when you're going to get the points. And you finish with close points in a lot of the games, so there's definitely a knack to doing it. I'd be quite interested to see what your actual ranking of these 10 games were. But frankly, I'm sure you guys could come up with 1,000 other games that I've not mentioned. And, just to run off a few honourable mentions here, all of these made my list, right, my short list. 7 Wonders. Too much iconography, I think, for the depth it has. Reef. Not a huge amount of depth in that one compared to something like Splendor, but I do love that game. Viral. Thought maybe there was a few too many rules in that one, despite being a relatively simple area control. Ray Cult. Yeah, probably a bit overreaching there. Abyss. Same thing. Raptor. You got a lot of different action cards and a lot of different action points to spend on. It gets a little bit fiddly teaching new players Raptor. Bunny Kingdom, too many cards with the draft. Dream Home, not enough depth. Even with the expansion, it adds more ways to score, but you kind of got dumb choice and right choice. It's a very calm, zen-like game, that one, so I didn't think it really made a high depth category. Takinoko was tempting. I find, though, that gateway gamers struggle a bit with that one, hence I don't consider Takinoko to be a gateway game anymore. And there's a fair amount you have to consider, but I don't think it's, ridiculously heavy. I almost put on this, maybe you could class Takinoko as an 11 or 12 for me. Passing Through Petra, a new game from Renegade Games. Not that difficult to teach the rules, but when you're trying to figure out what your pawn's doing on the action board and, how you're going to manipulate all your tiles to do engine building shenanigans, there's quite a lot of depth to it. Azul, I don't think there's that much depth to Azul, really. I mean, it's usually pretty simple to know which tiles you want to pick. It's just a case of, are the tiles there before it gets back round to you? Yes, there are decisions you make, but I just wasn't thinking it was like quite the high depth I needed. And I'm not a big fan of the sequel it did. Cash grab. Majesty for the Realm, I mentioned it. You could probably replace Splendor with Majesty for the Realm. It's the same designer, same kind of level of complexity. Imhotep. I wasn't quite certain on this one. I mean, you could consider it in my teens. There's a fair amount of depth to it, but I think most of it just comes from the fact that you're hoping that the other players don't screw you over more than anything else. Kanagawa, I didn't think that one had too much depth to it, and you do have to learn a few rules in it, so again, I just wasn't certain. Dominion, probably too many effects going off with the cards. Citadels, 8 rolls, and the ability to do that, I don't know, maybe it's a little bit above the complexity line. Pioneer Days, yeah, that was overreaching myself. Otis, there's quite a few things you have to teach with those divers and that. And that was all I'd written down on this particular list. But like I say, most of these I probably could have made an argument for this top 10, but for whatever reason, there's only 10 spaces. I have to fill them with something. Hence, like I say, take the ranking with a pinch of salt. I'm sure you guys might even think that some of these belonged on the list and some of mine came off. Which ones were they? In terms of Patreon choices, there's not really much to mention this time round because most people said choices that I already mentioned on that honourable list. And, or that I'd already mentioned, like I said, Splendor came up, Hanamakoji came up. The only one that was different was Decrypto, but I don't class that one to be too in depth, and it's not that complex. Although, blimey, the rules are written in such a way that teaching it is a nightmare. But I deliberately, and I forgot to mention this at the start, put the caveat to no party games. So no party games, not like the Mysterians and that, and no social deduction negotiation games. I specifically excluded those from the list. So, if you were thinking of one of those, I didn't allow it, but maybe you would disagree on that. I think one person outside of Patreon suggested Seven Wonders, but I'm not keen on that. I just think, yes, okay, drafting is not the most complicated thing to do, although it's quite a bit for some. And yes, there is depth to that game, especially with the expansions. But there's a lot of iconography you got to teach, and we may find iconography to be simple these days, but it's a lot of iconography. And for someone who's not used to that kind of thing, it's probably a bit too fiddly and a bit too complex to teach them. I don't class Seven Wonders as a gateway game for that exact reason. So if it was going to make my list, it would probably be in the 20s or something. It wouldn't even make my teens. I just think it's a bit above that fiddliness level to be considered low complexity. But like I say, there's thousands of games you could pick for this list. This was pretty much a chance to just talk about 10 that came to mind more fast than others. Frankly, you could rank them differently. You could pick an entirely different 10 and rank them yourself, and you probably would have a brilliant top 10 list. So, that's all I can really say. Pinch of salt. So that's it for me. I'll see you on the next video. Not quite sure what it's going to be, but my next top 10 from votes by my Patreon campaign is going to be top 10 annoying characters. Yes, you remember the one that Dice Tower did, where they talked about various factions and characters from games that they find annoying? That was a really good video, wasn't it? So much so, I wanted to do one as well. So that's going to be my next one, as voted by my Patreons. So that's it for me. Find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Sign up to the Patreon campaign. I'm so close to the next target where you get to suggest a game that I have not reviewed yet, and I will buy the game and review it, do a video, and then donate the game to a local game cafe. Come on, let's try and get to that level, all right? We're so close. But also, if you like what you see, subscribe to this channel and just let me know what you think in the comments. I take all constructive feedback, and I love to hear your thoughts on the games that I mentioned and games that I've missed out. So take care, have a good day, and remember, as always, it's only a game. See you soon.